Cop accused black man of stealing his own truck. Turns out he's state attorney general. How could an accusation like this happen? What truth could completely change the way everyone sees this moment? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy powerful stories about justice, courage, and unexpected twists, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support means more than you know, and we're truly grateful you've chosen to spend your time with us today. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what would your first reaction be if you witnessed a situation like the one in today's title? Now, settle in as we go back to the moment when one ordinary afternoon took an unforgettable turn and set the stage for a story no one on that street would ever forget. If you're certain you already know the truth, that's usually the moment you're most likely to be wrong. The command echoed across the Broadstone Plaza outside the State Judicial Center just after 8:15 on a bright Monday morning. "Step away from the truck," Officer Daniel Brooks called out, his voice sharp enough to turn dozens of heads at once. The chatter of lawyers, courthouse employees, delivery drivers, and early visitors faded into an uneasy silence. Every pair of eyes settled on a black man standing beside an older blue Ford F-350 parked along the curb. He looked ordinary in every possible way. Faded jeans, well-worn work boots dusted with dry gravel, a dark work jacket with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. His hands were steady as he slowly lowered a ring of keys, placing them on the truck's hood without saying a word. The cool morning breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe, while sunlight reflected softly across the truck's windshield. Nothing about the scene seemed extraordinary, yet somehow everyone sensed they were watching something important unfold. Officer Brooks took several measured steps closer, never looking away from the man. Years on patrol had taught him to trust what he called instinct, and at that moment his instincts seemed louder than anything else around him. "Whose truck is this?" he asked. Firmly, the man answered in an even voice. "Mine." A few people nearby exchanged doubtful glances. Someone quietly muttered that the truck looked too expensive for the man standing beside it. Another person lifted a phone and began recording before anyone had time to understand what was actually happening. The stranger never raised his voice. He never stepped backward. He simply rested his hands where everyone could see them and maintained calm eye contact with the officer. "I can show you the registration if you'd like," he offered politely. Officer Brooks barely acknowledged the request. "Stay where you are." The words landed like a locked door. Across the street, traffic lights cycled from green to red as commuters slowed almost instinctively to watch. A city bus paused at the intersection, and several passengers leaned toward the windows, curious about the growing crowd. The courthouse clock tower chimed the quarter hour, its deep bells rolling through the crisp morning air. The man standing beside the truck appeared completely unshaken by the attention surrounding him. There was no panic in his breathing, no anger in his expression, only a quiet patience that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. His name was Marcus Ellington, though not a single person gathered outside the courthouse recognized him yet. To every stranger watching through the lens of assumption, he was simply another black man being questioned beside an old pickup truck. No one noticed the small leather portfolio resting inside the cab. No one wondered why he had arrived at one of the most important government buildings in the state before sunrise. And no one imagined that within the next few minutes, one simple misunderstanding would force everyone on that sidewalk to question not only what they had seen, but what they believed they knew about power, appearance, and the dangerous cost of making assumptions too quickly. Officer Daniel Brooks studied Marcus for another long moment, convinced that silence meant hesitation instead of confidence. The pickup truck sat quietly between them, its faded blue paint carrying years of honest work rather than polished luxury. Dust clung to the tires, and a pair of worn leather gloves rested neatly on the dashboard. It looked like the kind of vehicle owned by someone who fixed fences, hauled lumber, or spent weekends helping neighbors instead of chasing attention. Brooks folded his arms. "You say it is yours. Then why are you standing outside the courthouse dressed like that?" Marcus answered with the same calm tone that never seemed to rise or fall. "Because this is how I dress when I work." The response sounded almost too simple, and that somehow frustrated the officer even more. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. A television reporter walking toward the courthouse slowed her pace after noticing several people recording with their phones. Two law students stopped halfway up the marble staircase, whispering to one another while watching from a distance. Near the entrance, an elderly security guard narrowed his eyes, trying to understand why the situation felt strangely familiar. Marcus remained exactly where he was. He understood something most people never learned. The louder one person became, the more valuable calm could be. Years earlier, his father had repeated the same lesson while teaching him to repair an old tractor behind their family home in rural Georgia. People will not always judge you by your character, son. Sometimes they will judge you before you even speak. Never let someone else's assumptions decide who you become. Those words had stayed with Marcus through law school, through countless courtrooms, and through every difficult conversation that followed. This morning, they echoed once again in the quiet corners of his mind. Officer Brooks reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder and requested a vehicle verification. While waiting for dispatch, he slowly circled the truck, studying every detail. He checked the license plate. He looked through the windows. He examined the registration sticker. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet something still refused to satisfy his suspicion. Marcus noticed the careful inspection but offered no interruption. The courthouse doors opened behind them as judges, attorneys, and clerks continued arriving for the day's hearings. Several recognized Officer Brooks and assumed he was handling another routine investigation. None of them recognized the quiet man standing beside the pickup. That anonymity had followed Marcus for years, partly because he preferred it. He believed respect earned through actions lasted much longer than recognition earned through titles. Inside the truck, resting on the passenger seat beside the leather portfolio, lay a folded speech marked with handwritten notes. The first page carried a single sentence underlined twice in blue ink. Justice begins the moment assumptions end. Marcus had planned to deliver those words less than 30 minutes from now inside the largest courtroom in the building, where law enforcement leaders from across the state had gathered for a conference on strengthening public trust. He glanced briefly toward the courthouse entrance before returning his attention to Officer Brooks. Time continued moving forward, but Marcus showed no sign of impatience. He knew the truth had a peculiar habit of arriving quietly, often long after certainty had already spoken too soon. The radio on Officer Daniel Brooks's shoulder crackled to life, filling the quiet morning air with bursts of static before dispatch answered. Registration is taking longer than expected, the voice reported. Brooks frowned. Delays rarely made him more patient. They only reinforced the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced back at Marcus, who remained standing exactly where he had been instructed, his posture relaxed, his expression composed, almost as though he had accepted that some moments could only be resolved by time. Several courthouse employees had now gathered near the front steps, pretending to check their phones while quietly following every word. A woman carrying a briefcase leaned toward her coworker and whispered, "If the paperwork is taking this long, maybe the officer is right." Another man nodded without hesitation. Assumptions spread through the crowd faster than facts ever could. Marcus heard every word, but his face revealed nothing. The cool breeze brushed across the courthouse plaza, lifting a few dry leaves that drifted lazily across the polished stone. Somewhere nearby, church bells echoed through downtown, mixing with the distant hum of morning traffic. It should have been an ordinary start to the week. Instead, the entire entrance had become an unexpected stage where strangers quietly formed opinions about a man they had never met. Brooks stepped closer again. "Tell me your full name." "Marcus Ellington." "Occupation?" Marcus paused for only a heartbeat. "Public servant." Brooks raised an eyebrow. The answer sounded strangely vague. "Public servant?" he repeated. "That could mean anything." Marcus nodded slightly. It could. The response frustrated the officer once more. He wanted simple answers that fit neatly into the story already forming in his mind. Instead, every reply seemed calm enough to challenge his certainty without directly confronting it. Near the courthouse entrance, the elderly security guard continued watching with growing curiosity. He knew hundreds of attorneys by face, but the man beside the truck still seemed familiar in a way he could not explain. Before he could think further, another courthouse employee approached him carrying a stack of folders. "They are asking whether everyone has arrived for the conference upstairs," she said quietly. The guard looked back toward Marcus before answering. "Almost everyone." Inside the pickup truck, sunlight reflected off the leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat. A gold-embossed state seal shimmered briefly through the windshield before disappearing as clouds drifted across the sun. No one standing outside noticed it. Their attention remained fixed on Marcus himself, interpreting his ordinary clothes as evidence instead of coincidence. Brooks took another slow walk around the vehicle, stopping beside the driver's door. "You said you work." "Where exactly?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "All across this state." "Doing what?" Brooks asked. Marcus offered the faintest smile. "Trying to make it a little more fair than I found it." The answer sounded philosophical rather than practical, and a few people nearby quietly chuckled. Someone muttered that the man talked like a politician. Another dismissed him with a shrug. Marcus simply looked toward the courthouse entrance once more. Behind the tall glass doors, several suited officials had begun checking their watches. The conference was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes, and its keynote speaker had not yet arrived. None of them realized that the person they were waiting for was already outside, standing beneath the morning sun, surrounded by suspicion instead of welcome. Officer Daniel Brooks drew a slow breath before making his decision. "I am going to need you to place your hands behind your back until we sort this out." His voice remained controlled, but there was no room left for discussion. The conversations around the plaza faded once again as every nearby phone tilted upward to capture the next few moments. Marcus looked directly at the officer, then quietly nodded. "If that is what you believe is necessary, I will cooperate." There was no sarcasm in his reply, no anger hidden beneath the words. He simply turned as instructed with the same steady composure he had shown since the encounter began. Several people in the crowd exchanged approving glances, convinced the situation was now proving the officer correct. Others watched in complete silence, unsure what to think anymore. The courthouse clock continued ticking above them while sunlight climbed higher across the limestone columns, casting long shadows over the entrance steps. Brooks carefully secured temporary restraints according to department procedure, never noticing that Marcus never once resisted, never pulled away, and never questioned the officer's authority. Instead, Marcus quietly asked, "May I make one request?" Brooks answered without looking up. "Depends on what it is. Please remove the leather portfolio from the passenger seat before the sun damages the papers inside." Brooks glanced through the truck window, but shook his head. "That can wait." Marcus gave a slight nod, accepting the answer without another word. Across the street, the young black boy who had been watching earlier tugged gently on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that man being treated like that if he stayed calm?" The woman hesitated before answering. "I do not know, sweetheart." Her voice carried uncertainty rather than confidence. The question lingered in the morning air longer than anyone expected. Near the courthouse entrance, the elderly security guard suddenly widened his eyes. Something had finally clicked. He had seen Marcus months earlier at a statewide legal conference, but always in a tailored suit surrounded by officials. Without the formal clothes, the polished shoes, and the state security detail, he had failed to recognize him. The guard instinctively reached for his radio. Before he could press the button, another courthouse administrator hurried toward him. "Have you seen Attorney General Ellington?" she asked with growing concern. "The Chief Justice is asking whether he has arrived." The guard slowly turned his head toward the plaza. His expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "I think," he whispered. "He has been here the entire time." Meanwhile, Brooks received another call from dispatch. He stepped a few feet away to answer, his forehead tightening as he listened. The registration still matched the truck. There was no theft report, no active warrant, no indication that the vehicle had ever been reported missing. The information should have settled the matter, yet Brooks could not explain why doubt still lingered inside him. He looked back at Marcus, who stood quietly beneath the bright morning sky, the gentle breeze moving the edge of his work jacket. For the first time, Brooks noticed something unusual. Tucked just inside the open jacket was a small metallic lapel pin engraved with the official seal of the State Attorney General's office. It caught the sunlight for only a second before disappearing beneath the fabric again. Brooks frowned, convinced it had to be a souvenir or some inexpensive replica. He dismissed the thought almost instantly. What he did not know was that inside the courthouse, an entire auditorium filled with judges, prosecutors, law enforcement leaders, and elected officials had begun checking the time, waiting for one man whose absence was becoming impossible to ignore. Inside the main conference hall, quiet conversations gradually gave way to restless murmurs. Rows of judges, district attorneys, police chiefs, and civic leaders filled the polished oak seats beneath the high vaulted ceiling. At the front of the room, a large digital screen displayed the morning's keynote session, building public trust through fair enforcement. The scheduled start time had already passed by several minutes. A coordinator checked her watch again before leaning toward the Chief Justice. "We still cannot reach Attorney General Ellington," she whispered. The Chief Justice frowned but remained composed. He has never been late before. Back outside, Marcus stood calmly beside the pickup truck, the temporary restraints still resting around his wrists. His breathing remained slow and steady as sunlight reflected across the courthouse windows behind him. Officer Daniel Brooks finished another brief conversation with dispatch, but the answers only deepened his uncertainty. Every document connected to the truck appeared valid. The vehicle identification number matched. The registration matched. The insurance was active. Nothing suggested criminal activity. Yet dozens of people were still watching, and Brooks felt trapped by the momentum of his own assumptions. He looked toward Marcus once again. "If everything checks out," he said carefully, "why did you not identify yourself more clearly from the beginning?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Because you never asked who I was. You only asked what I was doing." The words settled over the crowd like a sudden change in weather. Even those recording with their phones lowered them slightly, sensing that something important had just been said. Across the plaza, the young boy who had questioned his mother earlier looked back at Marcus with quiet admiration. He did not understand every detail, but he understood dignity when he saw it. Near the courthouse entrance, the elderly security guard could no longer ignore the growing certainty in his mind. He hurried inside and approached the reception desk. "Call the conference coordinator immediately," he said. "I think Attorney General Ellington is outside." The receptionist blinked in confusion. "Outside? Please," the guard insisted. "Do it now." Upstairs, the message spread rapidly from one staff member to another. Several officials exchanged puzzled looks before one assistant rushed toward the executive parking entrance to investigate. Meanwhile, the atmosphere outside shifted once again. The sound of approaching engines rolled softly through the downtown streets. It was not loud or dramatic, just a steady procession of well-maintained black sport utility vehicles turning slowly toward the courthouse entrance. Their polished exteriors reflected the bright morning sky as they entered the circular drive with deliberate precision. The conversations across the plaza stopped almost instantly. Officer Brooks glanced toward the arriving vehicles, assuming they belonged to another group attending the conference. Marcus also turned his head, and for the first time that morning, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile of victory or satisfaction. It was the quiet expression of someone recognizing familiar colleagues arriving exactly where they were expected to be. The lead vehicle came to a gentle stop only a few yards away. Before anyone stepped out, one courthouse administrator hurried through the front doors, scanning the crowd with growing urgency. Her eyes moved from the gathering spectators to the blue pickup truck, then finally rested on Marcus. The color drained from her face. She froze in place, clutching a folder tightly against her chest, suddenly realizing that the distinguished guest every leader inside had been anxiously waiting to welcome had never failed to arrive at all. He had simply never been allowed to walk through the front door. The administrator hurried down the courthouse steps, her heels striking the polished stone with quick, uneven rhythm. She stopped several feet from Marcus, her breathing unsteady as disbelief spread across her face. "Sir," she said quietly, "everyone has been looking for you." The words landed with a force far greater than their volume. Officer Daniel Brooks looked from the woman to Marcus, confused by the respect in her voice. Before he could ask another question, the doors of the lead sport utility vehicle opened almost simultaneously. For members of the Attorney General's executive protection team stepped onto the plaza wearing dark suits and discreet earpieces. Their movements were calm, disciplined, and unmistakably professional. The tallest among them looked directly at Marcus, then immediately noticed the restraints around his wrists. His expression changed in an instant. He walked forward without haste, but with unmistakable purpose. "Attorney General Ellington," he said respectfully, "we have been trying to reach you. The Chief Justice has delayed the conference until your arrival." The entire plaza seemed to lose its voice. Conversation stopped. Phones remained frozen in midair. Even the morning traffic beyond the courthouse felt strangely distant. Officer Brooks stared at Marcus as though seeing him for the first time. The ordinary work jacket, the worn boots, the old pickup truck. None of those details had changed, yet every assumption attached to them suddenly collapsed. Marcus simply nodded toward the protection officer. "Thank you. We experienced an unexpected delay." His tone carried no bitterness, no accusation, only quiet honesty. The protection officer followed Marcus's gaze to the temporary restraints and spoke with measured professionalism. "Officer, would you please remove those? The Attorney General is expected inside within minutes." Brooks stood motionless for a brief second before his training returned. His hands moved carefully as he released the restraints. The metallic click echoed softly across the silent plaza. Marcus rubbed his wrists only once before lowering his hands naturally at his sides. He did not display frustration. He did not demand explanations. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his jacket and looked toward the courthouse entrance where hundreds of public servants continued waiting. The elderly security guard slowly removed his cap, shaking his head in disbelief. "I should have recognized him," he murmured quietly to himself. Nearby, the young black boy watched every moment with wide eyes. He looked up at his mother and whispered. He never yelled. She swallowed before answering. No, he never needed to. Those simple words lingered in the cool morning air. Several people who had been recording lowered their phones completely, their expressions changing from curiosity to quiet reflection. One woman who had earlier questioned Marcus's presence looked down at the sidewalk, suddenly uncomfortable with the certainty she had displayed only minutes before. Marcus bent slightly and picked up the ring of truck keys he had placed on the hood at the beginning of the encounter. The familiar metal rested comfortably in his palm. Then he opened the driver's door and carefully retrieved the leather portfolio from the passenger seat. The gold state seal reflected brightly in the morning sun for everyone nearby to see. There was no dramatic reveal because the truth had been sitting in plain sight all along. Inside the portfolio rested the speech he had prepared the night before. The first page remained open to the sentence written in blue ink beneath the title. Justice begins the moment assumptions end. Marcus glanced at the words for only a second before closing the folder. Around him, no one spoke. Sometimes the loudest lesson arrived without anyone raising a single voice. Marcus slipped the leather portfolio beneath his arm and started walking toward the courthouse entrance with the same steady pace he had maintained all morning. No victory filled his expression. No satisfaction appeared in his eyes. Behind him, the executive protection team followed at a respectful distance, while courthouse officials hurried forward to greet him. Officer Daniel Brooks remained rooted to the pavement, watching every step with a weight settling deeper across his shoulders. For the first time since putting on the uniform that morning, he questioned not what he had seen, but how quickly he had believed his own assumptions. The courthouse administrator approached Marcus carefully. "Sir, everyone inside is ready. We can begin whenever you are." Marcus nodded politely before glancing back toward Brooks. The officer immediately lowered his eyes, unable to hold the gaze of the man he had misjudged only moments earlier. Marcus quietly changed direction and walked back across the plaza. The crowd instinctively stepped aside, creating a silent path between the two men. Every phone rose once more, expecting confrontation, criticism, or public embarrassment. Instead, Marcus stopped only a few feet away. Brooks spoke first, his voice noticeably softer than before. "Attorney General Ellington, I owe you an apology." The words came slowly, each one carrying more honesty than comfort. "I allowed my assumptions to speak before the facts did." Marcus looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Officer Brooks, every public servant faces moments that define who they become. The important question is not whether we make mistakes. It is what we choose to learn from them." Brooks swallowed quietly. The words were neither harsh nor forgiving. They were simply true. Marcus continued. "This morning, I could have reminded you of my title the moment you approached. I chose not to because respect that depends on position is never real respect. Every person deserves fairness before anyone knows their name, their profession, or the office they hold." The plaza fell completely silent once again. Several members of the media lowered their cameras slightly, listening more carefully than recording. The young boy across the street smiled faintly, hearing a lesson that would remain with him far longer than the morning's confusion. Brooks slowly removed his patrol cap, holding it respectfully at his side. "I understand," he said quietly. "I have work to do." Marcus gave a small nod. "We all do." Without another word, he turned toward the courthouse entrance once more. As he climbed the broad limestone steps, dozens of judges, prosecutors, and civic leaders waiting inside the glass doors stood almost instinctively. The Chief Justice extended his hand warmly. "Attorney General Ellington, thank you for coming." Marcus returned the handshake with a gentle smile. "Thank you for waiting." Together they entered the grand hall where hundreds of public servants rose to their feet in respectful applause. Outside, Officer Brooks remained standing alone beneath the bright morning sky. The applause drifting through the open courthouse doors reached him only as a distant echo. He watched the doors close slowly, then looked back toward the old blue pickup truck still parked at the curb. It appeared exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The truck had never changed. Marcus had never changed. Only the assumptions surrounding both of them had finally disappeared. The applause inside the conference hall gradually faded as Marcus Ellington stepped behind the polished wooden podium. Warm light filtered through the tall windows, stretching across rows of uniforms, judicial robes, and business suits. Every seat was filled. Police chiefs sat beside prosecutors. Sheriffs exchanged quiet greetings with judges. Young cadets occupied the back rows, notebooks already open. Marcus placed his leather portfolio on the podium and looked across the room without speaking. The silence that followed carried more weight than any introduction. He slowly opened the folder to the first page, then closed it again. "This morning," he began, "I planned to speak about public trust. Instead, public trust gave me a lesson before I ever entered this building." The audience remained perfectly still. No one knew exactly what had happened outside, but they could hear something different in his voice. It was not anger. It was experience. Marcus stepped away from the podium, choosing to stand closer to the audience instead of above them. "Many years ago, my father taught me that the easiest judgment to make is usually the least accurate one. He worked with his hands every day. He believed there was honor in every honest job, whether someone wore polished shoes or muddy boots." Several officers glanced quietly at one another. Marcus continued, "This morning, I arrived wearing the same clothes I wore while visiting a vocational training center. I drove the same pickup truck I have owned for years because it still runs well and reminds me where I came from. Before anyone knew my name, many people believed they already knew my story." His words settled gently across the room. There was no accusation hidden inside them, only truth. In the front row, the Chief Justice lowered his eyes thoughtfully. A sheriff near the aisle slowly folded his hands together. Marcus looked around the hall once more. Titles matter inside government buildings. Outside these walls, character matters first. The person standing beside the road deserves the same dignity as the person standing behind this podium. A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the audience. Marcus smiled gently before continuing. "Our badges, robes, and offices are not reminders that we are more important than others. They are reminders that we carry greater responsibility." Several law enforcement leaders nodded almost instinctively. The message was simple, yet impossible to ignore. Near the back of the hall, one young police recruit carefully underlined a sentence in his notebook. "Fairness begins before identification." Marcus noticed the movement and smiled again. Every decision we make teaches someone what justice looks like. Sometimes that someone is a frightened child watching from across the street. Sometimes it is a family deciding whether they can trust the system. Sometimes it is our own reflection at the end of the day. The room became completely silent once more. No phones vibrated. No papers shuffled. Even the heating system seemed quieter than before. Marcus paused, allowing the stillness to speak alongside his words. Then he added softly, "We cannot control every misunderstanding. We can control whether we approach people with curiosity instead of certainty." The audience rose into another standing ovation, not because they had heard a powerful speech, but because they had recognized an uncomfortable truth. Outside the courthouse, Officer Daniel Brooks remained on duty near the entrance, watching citizens come and go with noticeably different eyes than he had only an hour before. The conference ended just before sunset, and the courthouse slowly emptied into streets washed in warm golden light. Lawyers carried briefcases toward nearby parking garages. Judges exchanged quiet farewells on the front steps. Officers returned to their patrol cars with thoughtful expressions that had not been there that morning. Marcus Ellington lingered for a moment beneath the tall courthouse columns, breathing in the cool evening air before walking toward the same blue pickup truck that had unknowingly become the center of the day's most important lesson. The truck looked unchanged beneath the fading sky. Its weathered paint still reflected the last rays of sunlight. Its tires still carried traces of dust from back roads traveled long before dawn. Marcus rested one hand gently against the driver's door and smiled almost imperceptibly. He had never wanted attention. He had only wanted fairness to become ordinary. A familiar voice interrupted the quiet. "Sir." Marcus turned to see Officer Daniel Brooks approaching slowly, his patrol cap tucked respectfully beneath one arm. There were no cameras nearby now. No reporters. No crowd waiting to witness another dramatic moment. Only two public servants standing beneath the evening sky. Brooks stopped a comfortable distance away. "I spent my lunch break thinking about everything you said." Marcus listened without interrupting. Brooks continued, "I realized something that has been difficult to admit. I believed experience protected me from prejudice. Today showed me that experience means very little if I stop questioning my own assumptions." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Self-reflection is one of the hardest forms of courage. Brooks looked toward the courthouse before speaking again. "I cannot change this morning, but I can decide what tomorrow looks like." Marcus extended his hand. Brooks accepted it with quiet gratitude. There was no celebration in the handshake. No declaration of forgiveness. Only mutual respect earned through honesty. As Brooks returned to his patrol vehicle, he noticed the young black boy from earlier walking with his mother along the sidewalk. The child smiled and waved shyly toward Marcus. Marcus waved back with the same calm warmth he had shown all day. The boy looked up at his mother and said, "He was kind even when nobody knew who he was." She smiled gently. "That is probably why so many people respect him." Marcus climbed into the pickup truck, placed the leather portfolio carefully on the passenger seat, and started the familiar engine. The quiet rumble filled the evening air as he eased away from the courthouse without an escort, without flashing lights, and without seeking recognition. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the courthouse grow smaller, until it disappeared behind rows of trees glowing beneath the setting sun. Inside the leather portfolio, the speech remained folded to the page carrying the sentence written in blue ink. "Justice begins the moment assumptions end." Marcus never changed those words because after everything that had happened, they no longer belonged only to his speech. They belonged to every person who had witnessed the events of that ordinary Monday morning. Long after the plaza became quiet and the courthouse lights dimmed, one truth remained brighter than the fading daylight. A title can command attention, but character earns respect. And sometimes the strongest measure of justice is not found in a courtroom at all. It is found in the simple decision to see another human being before making up your mind about who they are.